They laughed because they thought they were looking at the least important woman in the room, but before the night was over, every smile would disappear. The grand crescent ballroom shimmered beneath towering crystal chandeliers that cast golden reflections across polished marble floors, where the city's wealthiest guests drifted from table to table dressed in designer gowns and tailored tuxedos, speaking in polished voices that carried confidence born from privilege. Every server moved with careful precision through the elegant crowd, balancing silver trays and greeting guests with quiet professionalism, but one waitress always attracted more attention than the others. Olivia Brooks had heard every nickname imaginable during her years in hospitality. Some whispered that she was too big for fine dining. Others assumed she lacked ambition because she worked long shifts carrying heavy trays instead of sitting behind an executive desk. She never answered them. She simply smiled, adjusted her apron, and continued serving every table with the same patience she offered everyone, whether they tipped generously or barely acknowledged her existence. That evening the ballroom buzzed with anticipation because everyone knew one particular guest would soon arrive. Ethan Park, a Korean businessman whose influence reached far beyond the city, rarely attended public charity events, and when he did, conversations stopped the moment he entered. His reputation filled every room before he ever stepped inside. Luxury sedans lined the entrance, while security personnel quietly coordinated every detail without disturbing the celebration. When Ethan finally crossed the marble lobby wearing an impeccably tailored black suit, every camera turned toward him, every executive straightened their posture, and every conversation softened into respectful silence. He acknowledged no one with more than a slight nod as he walked toward the head table reserved in his honor. Olivia approached with a tray carrying sparkling water and carefully polished crystal glasses, moving with the confidence that came from years of experience. She greeted him politely and reached to refill a glass, but before she could finish, Ethan glanced at her briefly and let out a faint laugh that nearby guests immediately noticed. "This place is supposed to represent excellence," he said with effortless confidence, loud enough for several surrounding tables to hear. "Perhaps they should start by hiring people who actually look the part." The words floated through the ballroom like invisible arrows. A few guests exchanged uncomfortable glances, but others chuckled without hesitation, eager to share the amusement of the evening's most powerful man. One woman covered her smile behind a champagne glass, while another quietly whispered to her husband, who laughed under his breath. Olivia froze for only a heartbeat. She lowered the pitcher carefully onto the serving tray, met Ethan's eyes without anger, embarrassment, or resentment, and simply answered, "I hope you enjoy your evening, sir." Her voice remained calm, warm, and steady. Then she walked away with perfect posture, as though nothing had happened. The laughter continued behind her for another moment before conversation slowly returned, yet something unusual lingered in the air. Several guests who had laughed no longer seemed comfortable. One elderly couple watched Olivia disappear into the kitchen corridor with expressions of quiet regret. A young busboy stared at the floor, wishing someone had spoken differently. Ethan accepted another conversation with influential donors as though the exchange had never mattered, completely unaware that the strongest person in the ballroom had not been the one surrounded by admiration, expensive watches, or powerful connections. It had been the woman who carried herself with dignity after becoming the easiest target in the room, and although almost everyone believed the story had already been written, the evening had only just begun. The applause that followed the charity auction sounded polished and effortless, yet Olivia Brooks barely noticed it as she carried another tray through the ballroom with the same quiet professionalism that had defined every shift she had ever worked. The laughter from only a few minutes earlier still echoed somewhere in the back of her mind, but years of experience had taught her that some words only gained power if she carried them home. She refused to give them that privilege. Instead, she thanked guests who accepted fresh coffee, smiled warmly at an elderly couple celebrating their 50th wedding anniversary, and gently reassured a nervous young server who had accidentally placed a dessert fork beside the wrong plate. To everyone who truly paid attention, Olivia seemed to possess a remarkable ability to leave every person feeling a little calmer than before she arrived. Across the ballroom, Ethan Park continued speaking with investors, charity board members, and executives who eagerly competed for a few moments of his attention. Every conversation centered around success, expansion, influence, or prestige. Compliments flowed effortlessly in his direction, and no one dared question anything he said. Yet despite the constant praise surrounding him, his eyes drifted more than once toward the serving staff. He noticed something unexpected. The woman he had publicly embarrassed never slowed down, never whispered complaints to her coworkers, and never searched the room for sympathy. Instead, she continued helping every guest exactly as she had before. When an elderly gentleman struggled to button his coat before leaving the ballroom, Olivia quietly stepped forward and helped without making him feel embarrassed. When a little girl attending the event with her parents dropped a slice of chocolate cake onto the polished floor, Olivia knelt beside her with a reassuring smile, telling the child that accidents happen to everyone before replacing the dessert with a fresh slice. The little girl's worried expression instantly disappeared. Ethan observed the exchange from across the room, without saying a word. One of the executives beside him chuckled as he glanced toward Olivia. "People like that should probably be grateful just to have steady work," the man remarked casually. Ethan gave a faint nod almost automatically, but for reasons he could not explain, the comment felt strangely hollow. It was easy to dismiss someone from a distance. It became more difficult while watching that same person quietly improve the evening for everyone around her. Near the end of the gala, Olivia carried several untouched desserts toward the kitchen. Before placing them in storage, she asked the catering manager whether the remaining food would be donated as planned. The manager admitted that a scheduling problem had delayed the pickup. Without hesitation, Olivia volunteered to stay after her shift ended to organize everything herself, so nothing would be wasted. She knew it would mean getting home well after midnight, yet she smiled as though the extra work were the most ordinary thing in the world. Ethan happened to pass the partially open kitchen doorway just in time to overhear the brief exchange. She had no audience, no cameras, and no influential guests watching her. There was nothing to gain from the offer except knowing someone else would have breakfast the following morning. For the first time that evening, the confident certainty he usually carried began to shift ever so slightly. The image of the woman he believed he understood no longer matched the quiet reality unfolding only a few yards away, and although he quickly returned to his waiting guests with the same composed expression everyone expected, an unfamiliar question followed him through every conversation that remained. What if the person everyone had underestimated was the only one in the room who had never pretended to be someone else? The following morning arrived with clear skies and the quiet rhythm of an ordinary workday, a sharp contrast to the glamour of the previous evening. Olivia Brooks unlocked the door to her small apartment just after sunrise, slipped off her comfortable work shoes, and carefully placed her name tag on a nearby table before checking on her mother, who was already awake reading beside the window. They shared a simple breakfast of oatmeal, fresh fruit, and coffee, laughing over a crossword puzzle as though the previous night's embarrassment had never happened. Olivia believed there was little value in carrying someone else's unkindness into a new day, especially when there was still so much good waiting to be noticed. After making sure her mother had everything she needed, she headed back into the city for another shift. Along the way, she stopped at a neighborhood bakery, where the owner quietly handed her a bag of leftover rolls that would otherwise be thrown away. Instead of taking them home, Olivia carried them to a nearby community center where volunteers prepared breakfast for local families. She never stayed long enough to receive thanks. She simply placed the food on the counter, wished everyone a wonderful morning, and continued walking to work. Across town, Ethan Park sat in the conference room of his downtown office surrounded by financial reports, development plans, and scheduled meetings. Every decision demanded precision, and every person around the table waited for his approval before speaking. Normally, his attention never wandered, yet several times his thoughts unexpectedly returned to the ballroom. He remembered the calm expression on Olivia's face after his careless remark and found himself wondering why she had responded with kindness instead of resentment. Late that afternoon, one of his associates suggested stopping by a neighborhood cafe before their next appointment. Ethan agreed without much thought. As they waited for their drinks, he noticed a familiar figure near the register. Olivia had finished her restaurant shift and was quietly paying for a warm meal that she handed to an elderly customer who appeared to be counting loose change with trembling hands. She accepted nothing in return, smiled, wished him a pleasant afternoon, and walked toward the exit before anyone else seemed to realize what had happened. Ethan watched through the cafe window as the elderly man sat down with grateful eyes while Olivia disappeared into the steady flow of pedestrians outside. She had no audience, no recognition, and no expectation of praise. The simple act stood in complete contrast to the polished speeches about generosity he had heard from wealthy donors only hours earlier. His associate glanced up from his phone and casually remarked that some people were simply too soft for the real world. Ethan looked through the window once more before answering in a quieter voice than usual. Or perhaps they understand something the rest of us have forgotten. Even he seemed surprised by his own words. For the first time in many years, certainty gave way to curiosity, and curiosity quietly began opening a door that pride had kept closed for a very long time. Over the next several days, the memory that should have faded refused to leave Ethan Park alone. He had negotiated multi-million-dollar agreements without hesitation, managed enormous responsibilities with remarkable discipline, and built a reputation for making decisions based on facts rather than emotion. Yet he found himself thinking about a waitress whose quiet dignity had unsettled assumptions he had carried for years. Instead of dismissing the feeling, he chose to observe without interfering. One afternoon, while leaving a meeting across town, he noticed the restaurant where Olivia worked serving the busy lunchtime crowd. From a table near the window, unnoticed among dozens of customers, he watched the dining room move with organized precision. Olivia greeted every guest with exactly the same warmth. Families with energetic children received the same patience as executives rushing between appointments. Elderly customers who needed extra time never appeared to inconvenience her. A nervous young employee accidentally dropped a tray of glasses, and before anyone else could react, Olivia calmly helped gather the broken pieces while quietly reassuring the embarrassed server that mistakes happen to everyone learning a new job. The restaurant manager approached, expecting excuses, but found the situation already resolved. The young employee's hands stopped shaking because one person had chosen encouragement instead of criticism. Ethan continued watching in thoughtful silence. Later that afternoon, after finishing her shift, Olivia changed into comfortable clothes and walked several blocks instead of driving home. Curious, Ethan remained at a respectful distance, never speaking or making his presence known. She stopped first at a neighborhood library, where a weekly reading program welcomed children from nearby schools. Without any publicity or recognition, Olivia spent an hour helping several young readers sound out difficult words and celebrating every small improvement as though it were a major accomplishment. The smiles on the children's faces carried the unmistakable confidence that someone believed in them. When the session ended, she thanked the volunteers before quietly leaving through the side entrance. Her next stop surprised him even more. She visited a modest grocery store, carefully comparing prices before purchasing only a few basic items. As she approached the checkout, an elderly woman in front of her realized she had forgotten her wallet. Before the cashier could suggest putting the groceries back, Olivia gently offered to cover the purchase. The older woman protested several times, but Olivia simply smiled and said that everyone needed a little help now and then. There was no dramatic speech, no expectation of gratitude, and no one filming the moment for social media. She picked up her own small grocery bag and walked into the afternoon sunshine as though kindness required no announcement. Ethan remained standing near the entrance long after she disappeared from view. The image of the confident businessman who had publicly judged another person now felt increasingly unfamiliar, while the woman he had dismissed continued revealing a strength that could not be measured by appearance, status, or wealth. Driving back toward his office, he looked out across the city with a quieter perspective than he had known in years. For the first time, he realized he no longer wanted to understand what Olivia Brooks looked like in the eyes of strangers. He wanted to understand who she truly was, and that single question marked the beginning of a journey neither of them could yet imagine. Nearly a week passed before their paths crossed again, and neither of them could have predicted how ordinary the moment would seem at first. A charity foundation hosted a community appreciation luncheon inside a renovated recreation center on the east side of the city. Unlike the glittering ballroom where they had first met, this event welcomed teachers, firefighters, nurses, volunteers, local business owners, and families from every neighborhood. Ethan Park had agreed to attend because one of his companies had funded part of the renovation, while Olivia Brooks volunteered to help serve lunch after finishing her morning shift at the restaurant. The atmosphere felt relaxed, filled with children's laughter, folding tables decorated with handmade centerpieces, and conversations that carried genuine warmth instead of polished formality. Ethan arrived expecting another routine appearance, filled with photographs and brief speeches. Instead, he noticed Olivia moving through the crowded room with the same calm confidence he had quietly observed during the previous days. She greeted every guest by looking directly into their eyes, remembering names whenever she could, and making each person feel welcome regardless of age or background. As lunch was being served, one of the volunteer coordinators suddenly realized that several additional buses had arrived from a nearby senior community, bringing dozens more guests than expected. For a few tense moments, volunteers hurried from table to table trying to reorganize seating, while worried whispers spread across the room that there might not be enough meals prepared. Before anyone could panic, Olivia stepped forward with remarkable composure. She quickly reorganized serving stations, encouraged volunteers to divide portions evenly, asked local vendors whether additional bread and fresh fruit could be delivered within minutes, and personally welcomed every late arrival with the reassuring promise that everyone would be served. Her calm voice transformed confusion into cooperation. Watching from across the room, Ethan saw something he had never witnessed inside any executive boardroom. People did not follow Olivia because she held authority over them. They followed because her quiet confidence made everyone believe the situation could be solved together. Within half an hour, every guest was comfortably seated with a complete meal, and the worried expressions that had filled the room disappeared beneath grateful smiles. An elderly veteran stopped Olivia before she returned to the kitchen and thanked her for treating everyone with dignity instead of making them feel like an inconvenience. She answered with the same gentle smile Ethan had begun recognizing. Everyone deserves to feel welcome at the table, she replied before excusing herself to help refill drinks. Those simple words settled deeply in Ethan's thoughts. During his own speech a few minutes later, he looked across the audience and found Olivia quietly collecting empty plates in the back of the room, completely unaware that she had become the person he respected most that afternoon. For the first time in many years, he shortened his prepared remarks and spoke instead about the importance of ordinary people whose kindness strengthened entire communities without asking for recognition. As the audience applauded, Ethan realized he was no longer searching for an opportunity to prove himself right. He was searching for the courage to admit that he had been wrong from the very beginning. The afternoon ended with guests slowly leaving the recreation center, but Ethan Park remained standing near the entrance long after the crowd had begun to disappear. Volunteers folded chairs, children chased one another across the basketball court outside, and families thanked the organizers before heading home. Olivia continued working quietly until the last table had been cleared, making certain that every borrowed plate had been returned and every volunteer had something to eat before thinking about herself. She believed leadership was measured by the willingness to serve after everyone else had stopped watching. As she carried the final box of supplies toward the storage room, she heard steady footsteps behind her. Turning around, she found Ethan standing several feet away, his usual confidence replaced by an unfamiliar hesitation. For the first time since they had met, he seemed uncertain about the next words he intended to speak. There were no reporters nearby, no executives waiting for photographs, and no audience to influence the conversation. It was simply two people standing inside a nearly empty community center as late afternoon sunlight stretched across the polished floor. Ethan took a slow breath before finally breaking the silence. He admitted that he had been thinking about the night of the charity gala ever since it happened. He acknowledged that his words had been unfair, careless, and rooted in assumptions that had nothing to do with the person standing before him. He explained that over the past several days he had witnessed her kindness in places where no recognition could be earned, and every quiet act had forced him to question the values he believed defined success. Looking directly into her eyes, he offered a sincere apology, without attempting to justify his behavior or diminish the hurt his words may have caused. Olivia listened patiently without interrupting. When he finished speaking, another quiet moment settled between them. She did not rush to forgive him, nor did she respond with bitterness. Instead, she smiled gently and said that everyone was capable of making mistakes, but not everyone possessed the courage to face them honestly. She explained that appearances often became the easiest way to judge another person because true character required time to discover. Wealth could impress a room for a moment, she said, but compassion earned trust that lasted far longer. Ethan lowered his eyes briefly, recognizing that every sentence carried more wisdom than any business seminar he had ever attended. Olivia continued by telling him that she had chosen long ago not to let cruel opinions decide how she viewed herself. Other people could misunderstand her appearance, underestimate her abilities, or question her worth, but none of those judgments changed the person she chose to become each morning. She believed dignity was something protected from within, not granted by strangers. Those words remained with Ethan long after the conversation ended. Before leaving, he thanked her once more, not because she had accepted his apology, but because she had given him an opportunity to become someone better than the man who had walked into the ballroom days earlier. As Olivia gathered the final supplies and switched off the lights, neither of them realized that their quiet conversation inside the empty community center would soon be tested before a much larger audience, where true change would no longer remain private. Several weeks later, the city's largest annual business and philanthropy summit brought together executives, civic leaders, nonprofit organizations, and members of the local community beneath the soaring glass ceiling of the Metropolitan Convention Center. Ethan Park had been invited as the keynote speaker, while the restaurant where Olivia Brooks worked had been selected to provide catering for the reception. Neither of them expected the evening to become the moment that would define everything that had happened since the charity gala. As guests filled the grand reception hall, polished conversations floated through the room once again. Expensive suits, elegant dresses, and confident smiles created an atmosphere that felt remarkably similar to the ballroom where Ethan had first humiliated Olivia. She recognized several familiar faces from that night, including a handful of guests who had laughed along with his careless remark. This time, however, she greeted each of them with the same professionalism she offered everyone else, refusing to allow old memories to influence the quality of her work. While serving refreshments near one of the reception tables, Olivia overheard two influential attendees quietly mocking another volunteer because of his worn jacket and modest appearance. One of them noticed Olivia approaching and smiled with unmistakable sarcasm. "Looks like they are lowering the dress standards again," he joked loudly enough for nearby guests to hear before glancing toward Olivia. A few uncomfortable laughs followed. The room briefly echoed with the same careless attitude that had once filled the charity gala. Olivia remained calm. She simply placed fresh glasses on the table and prepared to continue serving without responding. Before she could take another step, a familiar voice interrupted the laughter. "That is enough." The conversation stopped instantly. Ethan Park had been standing only a few feet away, having witnessed the entire exchange from beginning to end. Every nearby guest turned toward him, expecting another sharp remark. Instead, he walked directly beside Olivia and faced the group with complete composure. He explained that he had once made the same mistake they had just made, judging someone by appearance instead of character, and that it remained one of the poorest decisions of his life. Silence settled across the reception hall. Ethan continued by saying that the woman standing beside him had taught him more about leadership, integrity, and dignity than many of the most accomplished people he had met in boardrooms around the country. He reminded the audience that true respect could never be measured by a job title, clothing, wealth, or physical appearance. It was measured by the way a person treated others when no reward was waiting. The executives who had laughed only moments earlier lowered their eyes, unable to answer. Several guests who remembered the charity gala exchanged embarrassed glances as they realized how dramatically the situation had changed. Olivia looked at Ethan with quiet surprise, recognizing that his words were not spoken to repair his reputation. They were spoken because he genuinely believed them. An elderly woman attending the summit began applauding softly. One by one, others joined until the entire reception hall filled with sincere applause, not for power or influence, but for the courage to defend another person's dignity in the very place where it had once been questioned. In that unforgettable moment, no one saw a powerful businessman standing beside a waitress. They saw two people whose choices had transformed not only each other, but the hearts of everyone willing to witness what genuine respect truly looked like. The reception ended, but the conversation that unfolded inside the convention center continued, spreading throughout the city in ways neither Ethan Park nor Olivia Brooks could have anticipated. Several guests who had witnessed Ethan's public defense began sharing the story with friends and colleagues, not because a powerful businessman had spoken, but because they had watched someone willingly admit his own mistake without protecting his pride. Within days, community organizations invited Ethan to participate in discussions about leadership, while local volunteers quietly praised the waitress whose dignity had inspired the unexpected transformation. Olivia, however, returned to her ordinary routine exactly as she always had. She reported to work before sunrise, greeted customers with the same warm smile, cared for her mother each evening, and continued volunteering whenever her schedule allowed. She never mentioned the applause at the convention center or the speech that had surprised everyone in attendance. To her, kindness only retained its value when it continued after recognition faded. Ethan noticed that nothing about Olivia had changed after receiving public respect. That realization affected him more deeply than any compliment he had ever received. One afternoon, he visited the neighborhood community center where she regularly volunteered, not as a guest of honor and not surrounded by assistants, but carrying several boxes of books and school supplies that had been requested by local teachers. Olivia looked up with quiet surprise as he walked through the doorway dressed simply, without the formal appearance that usually surrounded him. Instead of taking charge, he asked where the supplies should be placed and whether there was anything else that needed to be done. For the next several hours, they worked side by side assembling reading kits, organizing classroom materials, and preparing activity tables for children arriving after school. The volunteers treated Ethan no differently than anyone else, handing him folding chairs to arrange, boxes to unpack, and tables to clean. To his own surprise, he found genuine satisfaction in completing ordinary tasks that brought comfort to other people. During a short break, one of the children participating in the reading program approached Ethan and innocently asked whether he worked at the community center every day. Ethan smiled before answering that he was still learning how to help. Olivia overheard the exchange and quietly laughed, not at him, but with genuine appreciation for his honesty. As the afternoon came to an end, the director of the center thanked both of them for their time. She remarked that children rarely remembered expensive donations years later, but they always remembered adults who made them feel important. Ethan glanced toward Olivia and realized those words perfectly described her influence. She had never changed the world through wealth, authority, or recognition. She changed it one conversation, one encouraging smile, and one thoughtful action at a time. Driving home beneath the warm colors of the setting sun, Ethan reflected on how dramatically his definition of strength had evolved. Once, he believed power meant commanding attention the moment he entered a room. Now he understood that real strength often entered quietly, served without complaint, lifted others without seeking credit, and left behind a lasting sense of hope. The greatest lesson of his life had not come from a boardroom, a negotiation, or a financial victory. It had come from a woman whom he had once underestimated, and every day afterward, he became more determined to ensure that the respect he had finally learned would be reflected not only in his words, but in every decision he made. Months passed, and life settled into a rhythm that neither Ethan Park nor Olivia Brooks could have imagined on the night their paths first crossed. The headlines faded, the applause became a distant memory, and the city moved on to new stories, yet the quiet changes they had inspired continued growing beneath the surface. Ethan introduced new community partnerships through his companies, expanded educational programs for underserved neighborhoods, and quietly encouraged every manager under his leadership to evaluate people by character, dedication, and integrity rather than appearance or first impressions. He no longer viewed those decisions as acts of generosity. They were simply the standard he believed every leader should uphold. Olivia remained exactly who she had always been. She continued serving customers with patience, volunteering after work, reading with children at the community center, and caring for her mother with the same devotion that had shaped every choice she made. The recognition she had received never altered her humility because she had never measured her worth through public approval. One crisp autumn afternoon, the community center celebrated its anniversary with a neighborhood gathering that welcomed families from every corner of the city. Children proudly displayed artwork covering the walls, local musicians performed familiar songs, and volunteers prepared homemade meals for hundreds of guests. Ethan arrived carrying boxes of books that had been donated through one of his literacy programs. Olivia greeted him with the same warm smile she offered every visitor. There was no awkwardness between them anymore, only quiet mutual respect built through countless ordinary moments. As the afternoon unfolded, the director of the center invited several volunteers to the front of the room to thank everyone whose efforts had helped transform the organization over the years. To Olivia's surprise, her name was called first. Embarrassed by the attention, she walked toward the small stage while children applauded enthusiastically from the front row. The director explained that many volunteers had come and gone, but Olivia had never missed an opportunity to encourage others, comfort families, or remind every child that they mattered. She then invited Ethan to say a few words. Looking across the room, he smiled before speaking with calm sincerity. He admitted that when he had first met Olivia, he believed success could be measured by influence, wealth, and appearance. He confessed that he had been completely mistaken. He told the audience that the strongest people were often those who quietly carried burdens no one else could see while still finding the strength to lift others every single day. Turning toward Olivia, he thanked her publicly for teaching him a lesson that no amount of money could have purchased and no position of authority could have provided. The room became wonderfully silent before warm applause slowly filled every corner of the building. Olivia simply smiled and thanked everyone for believing that kindness still mattered. As families prepared to leave, children laughed across the playground, neighbors exchanged warm embraces, and volunteers cleaned tables together without being asked. Ethan looked around the room and realized that true influence was never created through fear or status. It was created through compassion that inspired other people to become kinder themselves. Olivia gathered the last stack of books and switched off the lights one final time before stepping outside into the golden evening. The world had not changed because one powerful man had spoken. It had changed because one ordinary woman had refused to let another person's judgment define her worth. And on that quiet evening, everyone who had witnessed their journey understood something they would never forget. Dignity does not ask for permission, respect cannot be demanded, and the greatest strength will always belong to the heart that chooses kindness when the world expects something else.